Okay, so let's take a look at some respiratory anatomy. So here we've got the nasal cavity, here you've got the oral cavity, and they both join posteriorly in a structure called the pharynx. Here's the larynx, which is the voice box. Here's the trachea, which is the windpipe, and it splits off and goes to the right lung and to the left lung. And the smaller tubes are called bronchi. Here's the right main stem bronchus, the left main stem bronchus. This is all the conducting zone, the major respiratory structures to bring air into the body and out of the body. So we'll zoom in here on the upper airway again. So here's the nostril, this is the nasal cavity, here's the oral cavity. Look how large the tongue is. It occupies a lot of space in the oral cavity. So in the back of the nose, we've got the nasopharynx. In the back of the mouth, we have the oropharynx. So again, the pharynx is the back of the throat here. So when you have a sore throat, it's called pharyngitis. If we go inferiorly, we'll see here's the epiglottis. This is the trap door that when you swallow food, it flips downward inferiorly and covers the trachea. Trachea is anterior, the esophagus is posterior. So here's the trachea, the air tube. Here's the esophagus, is the food tube. Food tube's always collapsed. The trachea is always open. So again, the epiglottis flips down, covers the trachea, so this way you don't choke on your food or drink. Here are the vocal folds, the vocal cords, the thyroid cartilage and a cricoid cartilage. These form your Adam's apple. Okay, here's another view. Again, nasal cavity, oral cavity, the tongue. Here's the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Again, here's the larynx here, the voice box. Here are the vocal cords. Here's the trachea anteriorly. Here's the esophagus posteriorly. An easy way to remember is in all those movies where there's somebody choking on the airplane, they say, "Hey, is there a doctor? Is there a doctor?" They take a pen and they stick a pen in someone's neck. The first tube you get to is the air tube. That's the trachea. Okay, here's a view of the larynx. And there's some major structures here. Here's the hyoid bone. By the way, this is an anterior view, and this is a right lateral view. Here's the hyoid bone, and inferior to that, we've got the thyroid cartilage, and inferior to that is a cricoid cartilage. In between the two is a cricothyroid membrane or cricothyroid ligament. That is what's pierced when you need to cut someone's neck open to access their airway in the event of a swollen airway or laryngeal edema. The laryngeal prominence, this is what we call the Adam's apple. This is more prominent in males than females. And then we've got the tracheal cartilages, and in the lateral view you can see they're C-shaped cartilages, so closed laterally, closed anteriorly, and there's a muscle that lines them posteriorly. It's important the cartilages are there because that way the trachea stays open. Here is a view of the vocal cords, and so here we have posterior, anterior. So here are the vocal cords here. They form a V shape. And if you look through the vocal cords, we'll see the space. This is called the glottis. And here we can see the trachea, the rings of the trachea, and posteriorly there's the esophagus. Okay, here's a view of the entire airway. Here we've got the larynx, so the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, the cricothyroid membrane, the trachea with the tracheal rings, right lung, left lung, and the trachea splits into the right mainstem bronchus, left mainstem bronchus. They're called primary bronchi, and they branch off to smaller and smaller ones called secondary bronchi. Those secondary bronchi branch off, and become very, very, very small airways. These folks here are called terminal bronchioles, and they get smaller and smaller, and they turn into respiratory bronchioles, which then get smaller and smaller, and then they're called alveolar ducts, which open up into the alveoli here. Alveolus is one, alveoli is plural, and together they form, looks like a bag of grapes. These are alveolar sacs. Now it's important to note that the bronchioles are surrounded by smooth muscle. You have no control over them. They are under involuntary control. And embedded in the smooth muscle are the beta-2 receptors. If we target beta-2 receptors, then if we agonize them, that means that we cause the smooth muscle to relax and we bronchodilate. If we antagonize them, that means we cause the smooth muscle to contract and we got bronchoconstriction, which is not good for air exchange. Lastly, we'll see that each of these alveolar sacs is surrounded by a network of capillaries. So we have deoxygenated blood coming from the right side of the heart, so right atrium, right ventricle, out through the pulmonary artery, well, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery, pulmonary arterioles, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller from capillaries, and these are made up of simple squamous cells, as are the alveoli. So we have the normal easy diffusion of carbon dioxide from the capillaries into the alveolar space, and we also pick up oxygen that you've inhaled, and the oxygen diffuses easily into the capillary space, and now that oxygenated blood needs to return back to the heart, and it's in the capillaries, and these get bigger and bigger and form venules, pulmonary venules, then pulmonary veins, and dump into the left atrium, which gets pumped to the left ventricle and out to the rest of the body. Here we have a close-up view. Here is a cutaway view of one single alveolus, and we can see the simple squamous cells here. There's some other kinds of accessory cells, but we're focusing on the fact that it's simple squamous, one cell thick, which makes for very easy diffusion. Here in this micrograph, we see a cutaway view of blood vessels. Here's the bronchiole and the alveolar duct, and you can actually see the individual alveoli that make up the alveolar sac. The lungs are divided up into lobes. There are 3 lobes for the right lung and 2 for the left lung. There's a superior, a middle, and an inferior lobe for the right lung. For the left lung, there is a superior and inferior lobe. There is a spot here for the heart, and that's called the cardiac notch, and that's why there are only 2 lobes on this side and 3 on this side, because there's a spot cut out for the heart. And lastly, reminder about the parietal and the visceral pleura of the lungs. Here we zoom in here, and we'll see that the innermost membrane that physically touches and wraps the lung is the visceral pleura. The outermost membrane that's attached to the chest wall, to the intercostal muscles, and to the ribs is the parietal pleura, and in between the two is the pleural cavity, filled with pleural fluid, a little bit of pleural fluid that acts as a lubricant to reduce friction and increase surface tension so these two membranes stick together. When we have a collapsed lung or a pneumothorax, air fills the pleural cavity here and encroaches on the lung.